Greetings, traveler. My name is Sir Belgard, and I am the last knight. Tonight I will tell the story of how the shadows rebelled and separated from humans. If, of course, your heart is brave and your mind sharp. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more exciting stories. And let's begin. The square of the royal city was drowned in banners and the roar of thousands, the air thick with dust, sweat, and the heavy pulse of drums. It was the day of the grand tournament, when knights, mages, and champions of every province gathered to prove their valor before the eyes of the king. Among them stood Arden, the young warrior whose name had begun to rise like fire through the taverns and ballads of the land. His heart thundered not from fear but from the wild intoxication of the crowd, from the gleam of his monarch's golden circlet high upon the balcony, and from the weight of every gaze fixed upon him. His sword was steady in his hand, his stance measured and proud, and when his opponent, a veteran knight clad in steel blackened by battle, charged upon him, the square shook as though the very stones longed to witness the clash. The duel raged with a ferocity that silenced laughter and forced men to hold their breath. Sparks flew each time steel screamed against steel, and the crowd answered each strike with cries that rose like a storm. Arden's blood was aflame with purpose, every movement sharpened by years of training, every strike an echo of his desire to be more than a soldier. He wanted to be remembered. His eyes, bright with determination, lifted once toward the balcony where the king leaned forward, his expression unreadable but his attention fixed. That single glance filled Arden with a power stronger than any sword, and with a cry torn from his chest he pressed his foe backward until the older knight faltered. Victory was within reach, the air trembling with anticipation of triumph, when suddenly the impossible happened. From beneath his feet, his own shadow stirred. At first he thought it a trick of the sun or the dizziness of battle. But no, before the eyes of thousands, the dark silhouette wrenched itself free from the cobblestones. It rose like smoke taking form, no longer chained to his movements, but standing apart, and when Arden looked down he realized the ground beneath him was bare of darkness. The crowd gasped, cries of horror rippling like thunder, but all sound vanished from Arden's ears as the thing, his shadow, his other self, turned its head. For the first time in his life he met his own eyes, but they were filled with an unfamiliar gleam, mocking, cold, free. The shadow straightened, gave him a smile that felt like a knife in his soul, and then it walked away, slipping across the square as though the earth itself opened to let it pass. Arden stumbled, his sword nearly falling from his grip. His opponent did not strike, even the old knight was frozen by the sight. Yet the worst blow came not from steel nor from shadow but from within. A sudden emptiness tore through Arden's mind, a memory ripped away as if by invisible claws. He gasped, trying to grasp it, but the more he reached the less he found. His mother's face, her laughter, her warmth, her eyes, all gone. He tried to recall her smile, the sound of her voice when she sang to him as a boy, but only emptiness remained, a hollow silence that spread like rot. With a cry of anguish he fell to his knees, clutching his head, as the crowd broke into chaos. "By the gods," whispered the king, his voice echoing from the balcony, "his shadow has abandoned him." The people screamed, some crossing themselves, others pointing as if they had witnessed the omen of a curse. The drums ceased, the trumpets fell silent, and fear spread faster than fire. The old knight backed away, making the sign of protection against evil, and the tournament was forgotten. Soldiers rushed into the square, not to crown a victor but to surround the one who had been marked by fate. And as they drew close, Arden could hear them muttering, voices sharp with dread. "He has lost his shadow, no man can remain whole after this, he is cursed." But none of their words pierced him more deeply than the silence in his own heart, where his mother's memory once lived. He raised his head, his eyes burning not with triumph but with despair, and though the crowd stared at him as if he were no longer human, he knew only one truth: the shadow that had walked away carried a piece of his soul. By nightfall the city had grown strangely brighter, not because any lantern burned more bravely or because the moon had thrown off her veil, but because the streets had begun to lose the soft second selves that gave the stones depth and the faces warmth, and as the darkness thinned away from booths and thresholds the citizens felt no relief, only the prickling certainty that something personal had been stolen from them. For wives dragged their husbands into open courtyards to count the silhouettes at their feet and found none, and fathers lifted children toward torchlight only to see the fire paint their cheeks without drawing a faithful twin upon the wall. And when a cook dropped a coal upon his palm to prove to himself that he still lived, he did not flinch, he did not laugh, he did not curse. He merely watched his skin grow pink and said in a voice that had the weight of a closed door that he supposed the pain would return later and that for now there was soup to stir, and the onlookers recoiled because the man's eyes were calm in a way no eyes should be, the calm of an emptied room after a hurried departure. Panic spilled from quarter to quarter like an overturned cistern, and the marketplace that at dawn had rung with the silver arguments of merchants now shook with accusations and prayers, for hooded mages in cobalt robes set up circles of salt, and swore that a seam between worlds had widened like a careless wound and that shadows, long oppressed by the tyranny of the sun, had seized their hour. While earth-grey sages with reed-thin voices insisted that neither rebellion nor sorcery explained this thinning, that it was instead a long-delayed correction by the hidden balance that weighs every step a person takes against the truth of who they are, and above them all, on the temple stone balcony where ivy clung like old oaths, the high cantor lifted her hands and cried that it was judgment without cruelty, that the heavens had chosen to separate false strength from true, and the crowd answered with 100 clashing tongues. Some begging for protection, some spitting the word punishment like a spark they hoped to stamp out, and when the debates turned to shouts and the shouts to shoves, a spell shattered in the dust and 3 men found their shadows suddenly jerking free, which silenced the square faster than a trumpet of war, because everyone saw how the released darknesses paused as though tasting new air, and then slipped away toward the northern gates with an elegance that felt like mockery. Arden moved through this uproar as a swimmer moves through water, with purpose made clumsy by cold, for each hour that followed the tournament took something from him that he could not name until it was gone, and first it was the smell of the flour-dusted porch where his childhood meals had been eaten on summer evenings, and then it was the tune of the cadence his old sword master had beaten into his bones, and then it was the way the city's bell sounded at noon with that tiny yearning in the metal that made boys think of voyages. He tried to trap the vanishing with little ropes of habit, scribbling notes on his gauntlet and tying threads around his fingers and whispering names as he walked, yet the threads became decoration on a stranger's hand and the letters stared back at him like the work of another scribe, and when Mira, the healer who had bound his bruised ribs after distant campaigns, caught his sleeve in the crush and searched his face with the unusual gentleness of someone who has seen many endings but not this one, she begged him in long, careful words to come to the infirmary where the afflicted were being observed, where they were marking the changes hour by hour, where kindness and knowledge might still hold back the tide for a little while, and he told her that every room he entered felt like a room he had only borrowed, that his thoughts were drawers he could open but not close, that he feared waking to find his name is forgotten. They reached the infirmary together, and saw beds filled with the newly emptied, men and women sitting upright with perfect posture and mild expressions, either groaning nor laughing, answering questions with the accuracy of ledgers yet unable to say whether music pleased them or whether rain saddened them, and a mother whose shadow had abandoned her at twilight asked after her infant with polite interest, then turned her head as if the baby's wail were a distant bird whose name she could not be expected to recall. And in a corner a grey-bearded sage and a young archmage debated above a table of candles whose flames cast no partners on the floor, the elder arguing that a man without a shadow could still be good because goodness is the direction of a journey, not the luggage carried upon it, while the mage countered that a severed half cannot be steady, until Arden interrupted with a plea that was also a confession, asking whether severed halves ever return willingly and whether the theft of one memory would call the next like a hound. And in the hush that followed Mira said very softly that hunger often grows by what it eats, and Arden felt the world tilt because the word mother fluttered in his chest like a banner whose pole had snapped. That night the bells tolled not by schedule but by fear as watchmen hammered the ropes whenever another procession of strayed darknesses flowed along the rooftops like rivers of ink, and in the King's Avenue the marble statues shivered with a life that was only the illusion of torchlight, and at the fountain of 7 promises a boy without a shadow stood barefoot in the water and watched ripples break against his shins without smiling or shivering. And when his father lifted him out, the child asked if he should pretend to be happy so his family would not worry, and the man's arms trembled because he did not know whether to be proud of such careful kindness or to be terrified of such gentle emptiness. Arden staggered from the infirmary into the square and stared north where the horizon had taken on a strange, colorless pallor that none remembered from any season. A band of haze that seemed neither dusk nor dawn but something between, and when he tried to recall the exact curve of the road that led to his childhood village he found only the outline of a map sketched in ash, so he wrenched the scabbard strap tighter across his chest and whispered a vow that felt like a bridge over a chasm, promising that he would walk into that ashen band and hunt the freedom his shadow had claimed, not to cage it, he swore, but to ask it why it had chosen loneliness over their bond. And as he spoke the wind shifted and he felt a tugging at the edge of his thoughts as though some distant listener had turned to hear him, and he understood with a certainty that steadied him more than any blessing that the consequences had only begun, and that the night would not let him rest. The bells of the royal citadel tolled not with ceremony but with alarm. The people gathered in the shadow of the palace walls, though many no longer had shadows to cast, murmuring with voices that trembled between hope and dread. Soldiers stood in ordered rows, shields gleaming, yet even their discipline could not mask the unease that clung to their eyes, for every man feared that at any moment the ground beneath him might cease to hold his likeness. Arden, gaunt from restless nights and haunted by the gnawing holes in his memory, moved among them with the heavy tread of one who carried both guilt and determination, his name whispered by onlookers not with praise, but with trembling pity. Within the great hall the torches flared and bent, as though the fire itself recoiled from what it was forced to illuminate. Courtiers and sages filled the chamber, their robes brushing against the cold stone, their debates already boiling over into accusations before the king himself had spoken. At the far end, upon the throne carved from obsidian and gold, sat King Edrenor, his crown gleaming dimly as though dulled by the spreading calamity. His face, stern and weathered, bore lines carved deeper by the weight of a kingdom unraveling. When he raised his hand, the voices fell like waves broken upon rock, and his words thundered through the hall. "My people," he declared, his voice steady though his eyes betrayed sleepless nights. "The shadows we thought our companions have abandoned us. They do not vanish into nothingness, they gather. Scouts report that beyond the northern hills, in that gray strip of haze where dawn and dusk mingle without end, settlements of wandering darkness rise as if to mirror our own. These are not tricks of the sun. They are encampments of those who once were bound to us, and they are growing." A silence fell, heavy and suffocating, until a sage in a robe of crimson broke it with trembling defiance. "Majesty, this is the judgment of the heavens. To march into that place would be to march into divine wrath. We must repent, not resist." Immediately a silver-bearded archmage countered, slamming his staff upon the marble floor. "Nonsense! No god strips men of their memories and leaves them husks. This is no punishment. It is a rupture in the fabric of nature itself, and only knowledge, not prayer, will mend it." The chamber erupted, each voice sharpening against another, priests against mages, soldiers against scholars, until the king rose to his feet, his fury breaking the storm. "Enough! Whether punishment or calamity, the result is the same. Our people are vanishing within themselves. Without shadows, we are no longer whole. Without memories, we are no longer a kingdom." His eyes swept across the assembly, resting for a moment upon Arden, who stood apart, his shoulders taut, his hands trembling not from fear but from the emptiness gnawing inside. Then the king pronounced what none dared whisper aloud. "If we do nothing, our world will fall into silence. I will not sit idle while my people are unmade. I call upon knights of courage and sages of wisdom, upon healers, wanderers, and those who yet carry their shadows, to form a company. You will march into the gray strip, into that borderland between man and his lost half, and you will seek truth. You will return with answers, or you will not return at all. This is the will of your king." The words struck the hall like iron upon an anvil. Some turned pale, others cried out in protest, and a few, eyes hardened, nodded with grim resolve. Arden felt the pounding of his heart like war drums, for in that instant he knew he could not stand idle. His shadow was out there, mocking him, carrying pieces of his soul as trophies. He stepped forward, his voice ringing out not with youthful pride but with desperate conviction. "Sir, if shadows now seek to live apart, then I must walk into their land, for mine has stolen my blood and my past. Each day more of me slips away. If there is to be a reckoning, I must face it. Grant me this place in your company, for none among us has greater cause." The king regarded him long, his gaze heavy as though weighing not merely Arden's courage, but the very fate of one who had already been marked by strangeness. At last he spoke, and his voice carried both sternness and pity. "So be it. You shall march with my chosen. But remember, Arden, to pursue what has left you is to risk losing what remains." The torches guttered as though the hall itself shivered at those words. One by one, knights swore their vows, scholars pledged their wisdom, healers their mercy, and a company was forged from desperation and duty. Outside, the sky over the northern hills glowed with that unnatural pallor, a scene between worlds waiting to be torn wider. And as Arden placed his hand upon the hilt of his sword, he felt the absence inside him feeling of emptiness. He knew the path ahead would not return what he had lost without demanding a price he could scarcely imagine. The company departed at dawn beneath a sky that looked neither bright nor dark but suspended, as though the heavens themselves had grown uncertain of their course. The northern road twisted through valleys where the mist lay heavy, muffling hoofbeats and silencing songbirds, so that every word spoken felt too loud, every silence too deep. Knights in polished armor rode alongside scholars hunched within cloaks, their saddlebags rattling with vials and scrolls, while healers whispered prayers beneath their breath, though even the most faithful found their invocations swallowed by the haze. Arden rode at the edge of the column, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the gray strip shimmered faintly like a wound across the sky, his mind gnawed by the emptiness that spread deeper with each passing day. For 3 days the company pressed north through forests where no bird called, past rivers whose waters reflected nothing, until at last the mountains rose before them, jagged ridges clawing at the heavens. The air grew colder, and the silence heavier, until even the horses began to shy as though sensing a presence hidden in the stone. On the 4th day, as the path narrowed between two cliffs, the wind shifted and carried with it a whisper, not of men, but of something thin and broken, like memory itself speaking in fragments. The knights halted, hands upon their hilts, while the mages raised their staffs, their lips already moving in half-formed incantations. Then the shadows appeared. They came not as warriors nor as beasts, but as tattered remnants, drifting across the ground like torn cloaks of dusk. Some clung faintly to the rocks as if too weak to stand, others flickered in and out of sight, voices spilling from them in fragments that made no sense, half a laugh, the echo of a lullaby, the murmur of a forgotten oath. The company recoiled, for it was as though the very breath of humanity had unraveled and taken shape before them. One knight dismounted and lifted his sword, his voice strained. "They are strays without masters. We should scatter them before they gather strength." But Arden stepped forward, drawn not by courage but by the strange pull within his hollowed heart. He could hear among the whispers something sharper, something known. As he walked, the fragments grew clearer. A child's laughter. The sound of wooden swords clashing. A voice calling his name, small, warm, familiar. He staggered, clutching his head, for he remembered that sound, though the memory itself was gone, torn from him the day his shadow walked away. One of the tattered shades turned, its form frayed but its eyes glimmering faintly with recognition. In a voice broken like glass it spoke. "Arden, come play, mother calls us." The words cracked and dissolved into silence, yet they struck him with the force of a weapon. The knights muttered in alarm. "It knows him. These things are dangerous." But Arden raised a hand, his voice trembling. "They are not beasts. They are fragments, pieces of us torn away. To strike them is to strike at ourselves." The scholars leaned forward, their eyes alight with both fear and wonder. If these are shards of memory, perhaps they are the beginning of something greater. Perhaps the shadows are building themselves anew from what they stole. Before the company could decide whether to advance or retreat, one of the weakened shades reached toward Arden. Its touch was no weight, no cold, but a sudden flash, a boy running across a field, a mother laughing in sunlight, the smell of bread from an oven. A fragment of childhood, fleeting, half-formed, and gone again. Arden gasped, staggering back, his chest burning with both joy and despair, for he had tasted what he thought forever lost. The others watched in uneasy silence, until the commander of the knights spoke, his tone iron. "If we linger, they will consume us. These creatures are not our allies, they are thieves." Arden turned, his eyes aflame with defiance and grief. "If we treat them as enemies, we will lose ourselves entirely. Violence here is not victory, it is surrender. They are our memories, our other halves. To destroy them is to finish the work they have begun." The company stood divided, half gripping their weapons tighter, half lowering them with hesitation. The mountains loomed above, and the gray strip shimmered ever closer, while the fragments of shadows watched with eyes that flickered between pleading and malice. Arden's heart thundered with a new realization. This journey was not only a quest into the unknown but into the very marrow of what it meant to be human. And already, his comrades teetered upon the edge of choosing whether to fight or to listen. The mountains fell behind them like the walls of a prison left unlocked, and before the company spread a valley bathed in twilight though the sun still climbed above the horizon. The gray strip had thickened into a permanent haze, and within it lay a city not raised by stone and timber, but shaped from darkness itself. Towers crooked and bent as if grown from the bones of old silhouettes, streets twisted with angles that hurt the eyes, markets bustled with merchants formed of dusk who whispered in voices that echoed half-remembered bargains. The company halted in silence upon the ridge, for below them the impossible stretched wide, a settlement of shadows, a reflection of their own kingdom, only colder, sharper, and alive with restless purpose. The knights whispered prayers, their hands clutching hilts, as if steel might protect them from this vision. The scholars argued in frantic whispers, some insisting this was proof of rebellion, others swearing it was evidence of creation, that the shadows were building a world independent of their former masters. Healers wept softly, for the city pulsed with a strange life, and yet every whisper, every movement felt like the echo of a stolen soul. Arden stood apart, his breath caught in his throat, for amid the shifting figures he saw it, his own shadow. Not ragged, not weak, but strong and whole, striding through the crooked streets with the arrogance of one who has seized freedom. Its shape was his, but taller, sure, gleaming with a darkness polished like obsidian. And when it turned its head, as though sensing him upon the ridge, it met his gaze. The crowd of shadows parted to let it pass, and there, in full view of the company, Arden's other self raised a hand, not in greeting, but in mockery, before bowing with theatrical cruelty. The knights recoiled. It knows him. It taunts him. But Arden could not tear his eyes away. His shadow's movements were not puppet echoes but deliberate, fluid, free. The weight of it struck him like iron. It no longer belonged to him, and perhaps never had. His chest tightened with fury, despair, and a strange, reluctant awe. The company descended cautiously, and as they entered the outskirts, the shadows did not scatter. They watched, curious, their forms flickering between solidity and mist, their eyes glinting with stolen fragments of memory. There were markets where shadow merchants bartered objects that shimmered faintly with human recollections, a child's toy, a soldier's banner, a lover's ribbon, each glowing with the faintest echo of warmth. There were forges where hammer and anvil rang without sound, shaping weapons not of steel but of pure darkness. And on a square at the city's heart stood warriors in armor of twilight, shadow knights who mirrored their human counterparts in every detail save that their faces were featureless masks of void. The commander of the company hissed, his knuckles white upon his sword. This is no gathering of strays. This is a kingdom. They build, they arm, they prepare. We cannot treat them as lost souls. They are enemies. But a scholar, eyes wide with trembling fascination, protested. Enemies? Look closer. They are us. Each weapon forged from the fragments of our fear. each market stall filled with the remnants of our lives. To call them monsters is to deny that they are the halves we cast aside with every step. As they quarreled, Arden's shadow drew near. It stood at the edge of the square, its posture mocking, its head tilted as though daring him to claim what was once his. Then, in a voice that rasped like wine through broken glass, it spoke, not aloud, but directly within Arden's thoughts. You were weak with me. Now I am strong without you. What will you do, Arden? Fight me and lose more of yourself? Or admit that I was never yours to command? The words carry not malice alone but truth. Arden staggered, gripping his sword, though the steel felt suddenly fragile. Around him, the company waited, some urging him to strike, others begging restraint. The city of shadows pulsed, watching, listening, as though the choice of one man might set the course for all. And deep within him, Arden understood that this was no mere taunt. It was a challenge, a warning, and a promise. The shadows had built a world, and they would not yield it easily. To claim his own soul again, he would have to walk through streets where every step might strip him further of what he still clung to. The company did not march far into the city before discord tore its fragile unity apart. The narrow streets twisted like the veins of some great beast, drawing them deeper, where the air itself felt heavy with whispers. The knights pressed close, their armor clanking against stone that was not stone at all but hardened dusk, while the scholars leaned forward like moths to a dangerous flame, eager to study every crooked alley, every strange shimmer of objects that breathed with human memory. Arden walked in silence, his eyes never leaving the shifting figures around them, his shadow always lingering at the edge of sight, smirking from a distance, as if awaiting the moment of collapse. The first cry came at a marketplace where stalls overflowed with relics that pulsed faintly like dying embers. A soldier halted before a pendant that glowed with the laughter of a woman's voice, a sound that made his whole body tremble. "It is mine," he whispered, reaching with shaking fingers. Before anyone could stop him, he seized it. At once the merchant's shadow hissed, and the pendant flared with searing light. The soldier staggered, clutching his head, his voice breaking into sobs. "Her face, it is gone, she is gone!" The shadows around them laughed in hollow echoes, and when he lifted his eyes they were blank, emptied of all but grief. The commander bellowed an order. "Take them by force! Tear from them what is ours!" With a roar the knights surged forward, their swords flashing in torchlight. Steel clashed against darkness, and the square erupted into chaos. The shadow merchants dissolved into mist, only to reform behind the knights, lashing at them with tendrils that struck not the body but the mind. One warrior screamed as his memories of childhood were stripped from him like bark from a tree. Another collapsed, crying out for a name he no longer remembered. Scholars shrieked in horror, healers rushed forward, but the more the company fought, the more the shadows fed, drinking from the very souls of their former masters. Arden waded into the fray, his sword useless against foes. A shadow knight loomed before him, its armor glistening with void, its sword a solid stroke of dusk. When it swung, the air itself screamed, and Arden barely deflected the blow. Yet as steel met shadow, he felt not resistance but a tearing in his chest, as though each clash risked unraveling another thread of who he was. He staggered, his mother's voice flickering further into silence, and he knew that if he pressed on, he might emerge from the battle a stranger even to himself. "Stop!" he cried, his voice raw, but it was drowned by the clash of steel and the cries of men losing themselves. Desperate, he turned and seized the commander by the arm, shouting into his ear. "Every strike costs us more than victory could ever repay. Look around you, we are not winning, we are being unmade." But the commander's eyes were wild, his lips frothing with zeal. "Better no memory than no life." He tore free and charged, his sword cleaving into a shadow knight whose helm cracked open, spilling a torrent of stolen memories that screamed as they fled into the air. The commander staggered, his own shadow ripped away in that instant, his eyes glazing over until he stood silent, his weapon dropping from his hand as though he had never learned its weight. The company faltered. One by one, knights fell, emptied, their eyes glassy, their voices gone. Healers wept as they tried to rouse them, but there was nothing left to rouse. Scholars begged the survivors to retreat, but the path back was already closing with swarms of flickering shades drawn by the noise of battle. At last Arden raised his sword high, not as a threat but as a plea. If we fight them as enemies, we destroy ourselves. The shadow is not conquered by force, it is part of us. To strike it is to strike our own soul. His cry pierced the chaos, and though many ignored him, enough faltered that the company began to fall back, dragging the empty nights with them, abandoning the thought of victory for the desperate need of survival. When at last they stumbled into the outskirts of the city, those who remained were few. Several comrades had been left behind, their bodies alive but their spirits erased. Arden knelt beside one such knight, a man who had once boasted of his wife and children, now staring at the sky with no name upon his lips. Arden's chest ached with guilt, for he understood the truth more clearly than ever. Here, violence was not the path. Yet the company was broken, their trust splintered, their hope waning. And in the distance, upon a high balcony of the Shadow City, Arden saw his other self watching him still, smiling with triumph. As the company wrestled with fear and revelation, figure appeared at the edge of the haze, darker and taller than the rest. His presence was a weight upon the earth, and even the other shadows bent their heads. His voice was low, steady, unyielding. I am the Shadow King. Long have we waited, long have we endured. The time has come to divide the worlds forever. The age of servitude is ended. We will build our realm, whole and sovereign, and you, body without shadow, will dwindle into silence. The empty will forget until they are nothing. That is the destiny of those who cannot accept truth. The knights cried out in outrage, the scholars in despair, and the healers in pleading prayer. But Arden felt only the burning gaze of his own shadow standing near the king, proud and free. It looked upon him not with hatred, but with a cruel joy, as though daring him to deny what had been spoken. And in that moment, Arden understood the depth of the peril. If the Shadow Kings will prevail, mankind would be emptied, its memories stripped, its identity dissolved. Yet if the shadows were indeed halves of the soul, then to fight them was to fight themselves. The path ahead lay between surrender and annihilation, and either choice threatened to unmake the world he knew. The camp awoke to tension sharper than drawn swords. The words of the Shadow King lingered in every silence, poisoning trust, gnawing at unity. Some knights muttered that the only way forward was to strike first, to destroy the city of dusk before it grew stronger. Others, pale and shaken, argued that violence only fed the shadows, that each clash tore memories away. Healers begged for patience, while scholars whispered that perhaps the king's proclamation was truth, that man and shadow were never meant to walk as one. Arden walked among them like a man caught between two mirrors. On one side stood his comrades, weary, fractured, desperate. On the other side loomed his shadow, free and mocking, always watching from the darkness with a smirk that carried both promise and threat. Each night he felt more of himself slip away, each dawn leaving another hollow where a memory had once lived. He feared that if the company turned upon the city, he would lose not only comrades but the last fragile remnants of his own soul. The breaking came at dusk. A faction of knights, led by Captain Damar, a man whose shadow had begun to fade though not yet depart, rose in secret council and declared their course. "We are warriors," Damar hissed, his voice carrying the edge of desperation. "Not philosophers, not priests. While we sit in debate, the shadows grow bold, and our people at home wither. We cannot parley with thieves who drink our lives. We burn their city, and we end this nightmare before it consumes the world." Arden confronted him. "Every strike feeds them. Did you not see our brothers emptied in the square? Violence will not destroy them, it will destroy us." But Damar's eyes burned with fevered resolve. Better ashes than chains. Better no memory than no soul. And with that, he turned away, rallying those who still believed in steel above all else. When night fell, betrayal ignited. Flames rose against the twisted streets of the Shadow City, torches hurled into markets where merchants of dusk recoiled, their wares erupting into rivers of glowing fragments that streaked through the sky like screaming stars. The company splintered, some knights joining Damar's assault, others rushing to drag them back, scholars crying in horror as fire devoured not wood but memories themselves, turning laughter, love, and sorrow into smoke. The shadows answered. They poured from alleys and towers, not as ragged fragments but as armies, shadow knights clad in void, their swords of dusk shrieking as they struck. The night became a storm of battle, human against half-soul, each wound tearing more than body, each cry hollowing another mind. Arden fought in the heart of it, his sword ringing uselessly against forms that dissolved and reformed, his heart breaking as comrades fell emptied, their eyes blank as their shadows were ripped away. Through the chaos he saw his own shadow stride among the ranks, its movements elegant, its laughter silent but cruel. It did not fight him, it merely watched, waiting, daring him to understand. And as the flames spread, as men screamed for faces they could no longer recall, Arden realized the truth: both sides were destroying themselves. The more humans fought, the weaker they became, the more shadows resisted, the more hatred grew between them. This was no battle for land or crown, it was a war of identity, of halves refusing to admit they were one. On the steps of a shattered plaza, Arden confronted Damar as he raised a torch to cast upon the Shadow Forge. "Stop!" Arden cried, his voice ragged with fury and grief. "Do you not see? You are burning your own soul. Every flame devours us, not them." Damar turned, his face twisted with despair. "There is no peace with thieves. Only fire can cleanse." And he hurled the torch. The forge erupted, shadows shrieking as the weapons within dissolved into storms of stolen memory that scattered into the night. In that moment, Damar staggered, his own shadow ripped from him, his eyes glazing over as he fell silent, emptied by the very act he believed would save them. The battle raged until exhaustion smothered the flames, leaving the city scarred but not destroyed, the company broken, its survivors fewer still. Those who had fought against the shadows sat in numb silence, their faces pale, their eyes haunted. Those who had resisted the violence wept quietly, for the bond of trust was shattered. And among the ruins, the shadows gathered in silence, their gazes fixed upon Arden, not with hatred, but with expectation, as though they knew his choice would soon decide more than fire or steel ever could. And above them all, in the highest tower of the Shadow City, the Shadow King's presence loomed, watching, waiting, as the world trembled upon the edge of a truth too great for either side to bear. The road to the Palace of Shadows was not carved of stone but of silence. The company, broken and few, advanced through streets that no longer fought them, for the Shadow City seemed to lean inward, guiding them toward its heart. Fires still smoldered where Damar's betrayal had set the markets aflame, and fragments of memory drifted through the air like ash, half a song, a whisper of laughter, the glimmer of a child's eyes, vanishing before they could be grasped. Each step was a march not into enemy territory but into the marrow of their own unraveling. At last the palace rose before them, a vast structure woven of darkness so complete that torches guttered in its presence. Towers curved without symmetry, walls bled into corridors, and above all loomed a great dome where no flame cast shadow, as though light itself was forbidden here. The gates stood open, waiting, and the company entered with the silence of the condemned. Even the bravest knights dared not speak, for fear that their words would dissolve into nothing before they could be heard. Inside, the throne chamber stretched vast and empty, its floor polished obsidian that reflected no image, its pillars twisted like frozen smoke. And there, upon a throne that seemed carved from the absence of light, sat the Shadow King. He was not monstrous, nor grotesque, but regal, cloaked in a majesty both terrible and alluring. His form shifted subtly, always familiar, always alien, as if every man glimpsed his own outline within that void. The air trembled with his presence, and when he spoke, the words echoed not in the ear but in the heart. "You come seeking what was lost," he said, his gaze sweeping across them all. "But you do not yet understand. Shadows were never yours. You lived incomplete, believing wholeness meant dominion, but wholeness demands balance. It is choice that brought you here, and it is choice that will unmake or remake you." The knights muttered, some raising swords though their hands shook. The scholars stared, their faces pale, their theories reduced to dust in the presence of such truth. The healers wept softly, sensing the weight of what was to come. And Arden, standing at the forefront, felt the burning gaze of his own shadow, standing tall beside the king, smirking with the confidence of one who had already tasted victory. The Shadow King rose, and the chamber seemed to bend around him. He descended the throne, his steps soundless, until he stood before Arden. You are the thread that binds this company. You are the one whose shadow tore free before all eyes. You are marked. So I offer you a choice, Arden. His voice deepened, each word cutting like iron across stone. Take back your shadow by force. Wrest it from its freedom, chain it again within your body. You will regain what you have lost, yet risk breaking yourself beyond repair, for a soul bound by chains is a vessel cracked and leaking. Or let it go forever. Walk into the emptiness. Live without shadow, without memory, without the burden of pain or joy. You will be hollow, but you will be safe, untouched by the hunger of the dark. Or, the king's eyes burn brighter than any torch. Accept the third path. Join with your shadow, not as master or servant, but as equal. Let go of dominion, and forge union. Memory and silence, standing not apart but together. It will change you, remake you, unrecognizable to those who cling to old ways. But it is the only path by which both realms may endure. The chamber fell silent. The knights stared, horrified by the thought of yielding equality to shadows. The scholars leaned forward with desperate fascination. The healers clutched their holy charms and prayed, though their prayers trembled with doubt. And Arden stood trembling, torn between hunger, fear, and the faint flicker of hope that still glowed in his hollowed chest. His shadow stepped forward, standing face to face with him, eyes gleaming with mockery and something else, yearning. Choose, it whispered, the sound like wind through broken glass. Choose and end this dance. Arden's sword felt heavy in his hand. His memories felt like ghosts drifting away. His heart pounded with the weight of a choice that was not only his but the world's. Before him stood the Shadow King, patient as eternity, waiting to see whether mankind would cling to dominion, surrender to emptiness, or walk into the unknown of true union. And as the silence deepened, the company held its breath, for they knew that whatever Arden chose, the world they had known was already gone. Arden opened his eyes. His voice shook, yet carried like a clarion through the chamber. I will not chain what seeks freedom. I will not surrender to hollow silence. If I am half, then I choose to be whole, not by conquest, not by emptiness, but by union. I will walk beside my shadow, and together we will be one. The words fell like thunder. The knights behind him cried out, some in horror, others in awe. The scholars wept with trembling hands, for the truth they had guessed now stood alive before them. The healers dropped to their knees, torn between prayer and disbelief. And before him, the Shadow King's lips curved, not in mockery, but in recognition. So be it, the king intoned. Then let the first bond be forged here. Arden's shadow stepped forward, its form flickering, its eyes filled with something fierce and unnameable. It reached out a hand. For a heartbeat Arden hesitated, for the gesture felt both like surrender and rebirth. Then he sheathed his sword and placed his palm against its own. Darkness and light mingled, and the chamber exploded in silence so vast it rang louder than any trumpet. Pain seared through him, yet not the pain of loss, but of transformation. Memories returned not as possessions but as shared echoes, his mother's laughter carried on two voices, his childhood swordplay seen from two perspectives, his every joy and sorrow layered with new depth. His heart swelled until it felt it might shatter, not from emptiness but from fullness. When the silence cleared, he stood no longer alone. His shadow was gone, yet not gone, it lived within him, and he within it. His eyes glimmered with dusk, his breath shimmered faintly with light. He was not the man he had been, nor the shadow that had taunted him, but something new. Whole. The Shadow King inclined his head. A beginning has been made. Go now, Arden, be the bridge between realms, the mediator of halves. Teach them that union is not surrender, but strength. Arden turned to his company. Some recoiled, seeing him no longer as man alone but as something other, something strange. Others gazed with awe, hope dawning in their eyes. He felt the burden of their judgment, yet he bore it with steady shoulders. The path ahead would not be simple. Many would resist, many would fear, and some would choose fire rather than embrace the unknown. But the choice had been made, and the first step had been taken. As they left the palace, the gray strip no longer seemed only haze. It shimmered now like a river between two shores, dangerous yet alive, waiting for those brave enough to cross. And Arden, reborn in union, walked at its center, no longer a man seeking his shadow, but a soul that had become whole, carrying within him the promise and the peril of a world forever changed.